The last video we went over positive shapes and negative spaces. This video we will cover center of interest. So for some of you, you may have never in your life heard of center of interest. And it is basically the area that you want the viewer to look at most. And generally, that area that you want the viewer to look at most is the spot that you fell in love with when you were doing your sketches out in the field, or when you were in your studio and you were dissecting your plant and you put your oh God, what is it? Your hand lens on top of your flower, and you went, oh my gosh, look at this. I want to do this one, and I really want to do this large so that people can see what's just so beautiful when you put this under a hand lens. So there's lots of different ways of doing a center of interest. There's lots of different things that could be center of interest. Your center of interest could simply be a spot on a leaf. It could be a red dot on a leaf. It could be an insect bite out of a leaf, or the part where a caterpillar has taken chunks out of a leaf. Those all could be center of interest, as well as maybe some really nifty patterns of the veins. So, you have to kind of explore your plant. You have to fall in love with your plant. And you also have to pay attention to your feelings as you're sketching and drawing your plant, because what you fall in love with is generally going to make your heart leap. And when you find parts of your plant or anything in any subject matter, whatever painting you're doing, if you're finding something that's making your heart leap, that's telling you that this could really be a center of interest. And if it's not that, at least it could be a focal point. Now, the difference between a focal point and a center of interest is your center of interest is where your eye stops. It's not a hard stop like the cross arms coming down at a railroad track. It's more like a stop sign. You look both ways and you go. So with your center of interest, you want the eye to pause but not come down to a dead stop. We'll cover this in a little bit more, but basically if you put something dead center in your composition, that acts like an eye, which pulls your eye right to it, and it is very, very difficult to look away from eyes. So as a general rule, especially in this class, I am not going to allow you to put anything dead center because it's dead easy. I want you to create center of interest that will be somewhere within the composition that will help pull the eye around the composition. So your focal points kind of act as additional stops, but they're more like the shopping center white line that we're supposed to stop at, but most of us just pause at. That's what those should be. They should be a pause, not a hard stop. So your center of interest is the general. It's the commander-in-chief of your painting. And that doesn't mean it needs to be huge, like cartoons where you see the general all bulked up. I mean, it could be bulked up, but it could also be very small, like that little red dot in a leaf. That's enough. If you have this giant, massive green, that red dot will pull your eye right to it, and it will stop there. So it could be something very small that it takes a little bit to pull the eye around to, and once the eye finds it, it goes, cool, how wonderful. And your foot soldiers are those additional little leaders that your focal point provides to help direct the eye, which we'll go more into later. But they add directional lines, sometimes literal direction lines, sometimes it's just a slight angle, just to help pull your eye up, maybe in a circle, which is generally what most botanical art, the eye flow is within a circle. And it just helps to help guide your eye around. So you need this center of interest because you need your painting to have a point. If your painting does not have a point, why would anybody ever want to look at it? So it needs that point. If you don't have a center of interest or focal points, it means that your eye just never has any time to stop and rest. Your eye just kind of wanders around randomly, and then it just moves on to the next painting. So the point of your center of interest is to guide the eye around, to help give it an intent, a purpose, to serve a purpose in a way, a visual purpose. Let's do some real rough sketches showing you different types of center of interest, different ways you can, different parts of your plant that you could use to have a center of interest. So obviously, which you'll see very obviously, if I do, we've got a leaf coming up here and a leaf coming up here, and we have where does your eye go? Where do you stop? Is it right here? Let me get rid of that line. Is it right here? Now, why is that? You've got this shape here. You've got this coming up. You've got this coming up. But then you have these little thingies, and they're very different from the other bits. And I'm guessing, but note where your eye goes, because sometimes the way people approach paintings can be different, very different from each other. So I might be thinking that when I'm designing my painting that the eye, because my eye is flowing this way, that doesn't necessarily mean other people's eyes are going to flow in the same way. But I'm guessing you really look at this first, but you go down here and you go down here, because this little point right there where things come together with this pseudo daffodil sort of, this also acts as a little, a little subtle focal point. It's not meant to make your eye stop. And then you come up here and then you come back here and you bounce along these little points, but then you stay in there for a time. You can also make, let's see, we're going to do a flower. We're going to do another flower. That's just too bad. Get some more leaves coming in here. So when you look at this, where does your eye stop? I mean, you look at this, I don't know where your eye starts, but mine starts right here. Oops, let me do that, goes in. But it bounces along these little rays. It comes down here to these leaves, comes up here, comes around here, but it stops here. Why? Because it's different. Again, it's very small. It's got all of these interesting little shapes. But what it also is, it's a highly value contrast. It is black and white. So whenever you get something that's really black and white, your eye is going to go right there to it. So that's one way you can accentuate. We'll go over this more in the last class, but that is a way to accentuate your center of interest, is by darkening in the area around it, because that will just make it really pop. So let's look at an interesting texture. So if we we have like a lot of grass stems. And then we come in here and what happens to these? What does your eye do as I'm drawing these in? Get that one in front of these. Does your eye really start concentrating on these things? Do you see how having these different textures, a very, very different texture. And then if we wanted a much harder center of interest, what we would do is we would add like a different plant that maybe just has a very simple shape, so that when you look at this one little spot draws your eye to it. Now, I want to bring in color, a little bit of color, just so that you can see it. If we have, I'm going to do this, actually create a frame for this one. If we have your eye goes to that green. It's way weighted over here too, but your eye goes to that green. But if I fill this in with black, the weight of that is now just a little bit more balanced. To me, when I'm looking at my little side screen over here, this looks like it's about to fall off the page. It is weighted so heavily, but that color still moves you. If I was to add in just this teeny speck of red, where does your eye go? Where does it stay? Does your eye move around? You see this? Do you see that little eye of red? You stop there. You look at this, you go ins and outs through the positive and negative shapes, ins and outs, you examine this green, and then your eye heads right back to that red area. The last section we talked about center of interest and what goes into a center of interest and what makes interesting centers of interest. There is a handout that you should have received that looks sort of like this. And this is called the rule of thirds. You'll find on your handout there are these 4 circular areas. What those areas indicate are spots that make interesting places for your center of interest to go. Rather than having it dead center or on the outer edges, these spots, and I'm sure there's some kind of psychological meaning to that, but they just seem to make really good areas to put that center of interest, whether it's a landscape or botanical art, still life. They feel good when you get it in the spot. However, with botanical art, especially illustration, there are limitations sometimes to your plants, and you just can't get them there. So don't feel like you have to follow the rules of thirds, because you do not, because there are times where you cannot. And, you know, if you've got a single subject, which you will not be allowed to have in this particular class, but on your own, if you found a really interesting fruit and that's what you want to highlight, of course you're not going to be able to do rule of thirds. So don't feel like this is a rule or a law. It is just really helpful suggestion. There are things that you need to avoid when you're dealing with the rule of thirds, as well as just basic compositional, and we'll go over a huge stack of them towards the end of this particular class. But what you want to avoid, I'm going to draw out a larger rule of thirds here. Do you see how having that circle in the middle, and I know we've gone over this, but do you see how that just stops your eye movement? Another thing to avoid is you do not want your center of interest to be so what does that do? By having it right here kissing the edge, it takes your eye out. It stops you right here, but it's also taking you out. Your eye is concentrating right here where you want it to be, you know, concentrating on what's going on in your painting. And for those of you who don't know what kissing is, it's when two edges that you don't want to meet. And humans are, you know, it's hard not to look at people kissing on the beach. And it's the same thing when you have two things, you know, like a flower petal edge touching the edge of a leaf. That's called kissing. And that kind of thing you really want to stay away from. And part of it has to do with perspective. But kissing stuff, humans have a very difficult time to stay away from visually. And it becomes an accidental focal point. So you want to try and avoid that. Anything close to the edge of the painting as far as focal points and center of interest, don't get them too close to the edge. You also don't want to have highly, very, very detailed stuff right by the edge. You want to kind of keep your detailed stuff within this range. Because once you start getting detailed stuff around the outer edges, that again pulls the eye to where you don't necessarily too far out. You want to have it a little bit closer in. You also want to, you'll figure out a balance between lots of details and not so much details. Details can become focal points and center of interest, but too much, if we have lots and lots of details, going on, let's see. But where does your eye stop here? Here. There's less detail. It's also sticking out here at a really kind of odd place. So this shape being out where it is, if we do one that's right here, do you see how your eye stops here? So details don't necessarily mean that you're going to be getting a center of interest. It can also be something that's much more plain. You get these interesting, fascinating details that people will stop and definitely look at. But these become more of focal points where the eye can really, really, really stop. And keep in mind that when artists say rules, what I have found are they're actually guidelines. And because we're artists and we love to break rules, we call them rules so that we can say that we're breaking the rules. But technically, most of the artist rules out there are very good guidelines and suggestions that come from artists over centuries of working in art that work. And sometimes they'll work for you, sometimes they won't. But they're a good place to get started from. Now, when you guys get started with planning your composition, there's one thing that I've noticed that you guys struggle with when you're first beginning. And it has to do with a lot of times you think that a large mass of something will be a focal point because it's big. Now that has to do with dominance, actually with dominance and subordination. It's a dominant shape, but that does not mean that it is your center of interest because it's big. So I want to just show you a couple. If I was to do, let's pretend like this is a huge mass of leaves. I hope you guys are good at pretending. So we have this huge mass of leaves. This is not your focal point. If I do this is not a focal point. You need something more in there. This is just a mass of leaves. If I add, little berries coming down, do you see how those little berries, they help poke the eye around? If I was to do maybe the leaf as it's first emerging or first unfolding is really, really interesting, and I put this out here, do you notice how your eye stops here? Because it's something different. It creates its own little spot of difference that I want to look at. I look at these, but they make a mass. And if I turn this into just blacken all of these shapes in, they're interesting. You've got some interesting things going on with positive shapes and the negative spaces. Your eye is moving in and out and around throughout here. But it's just, when you create a mass, it would be, I think you've been hearing in drawing to squint, because squint helps to even out the values. When you squint at this mass, it makes a mass. There's nothing in that mass to give you any kind of details to stop at. It is just a mass. So keep that in mind as you're working on your center of interest.